She arrived at the gates with a single suitcase and a resume that listed more debt than experience, though nobody needed to know that second part. In theory, cleaning a stranger's mansion for minimum wage should have been the least interesting chapter of her life. In practice, one overheard conversation and one leather-bound diary were about to turn her whole story upside down. The taxi driver had refused to take her past the gatehouse, muttering something about the family that lived up the hill not liking unexpected cars in their driveway, so Amelia Hart walked the last half-mile with her suitcase wheels catching on gravel and her breath fogging in the October air. Marlowe House rose out of the mist like something built to intimidate rather than to shelter, grey stone and black windows, ivy clinging to the east wing the way old money clings to old rules. She stood at the base of the steps for a long moment before she made herself climb them. 26 years old, and this was the furthest she had ever fallen. A year ago she had been finishing a teaching degree with her mother's medical bills already piling up in a drawer she couldn't bring herself to open. 6 months ago her mother was gone, and the debt was not. 3 weeks ago the agency had called and said the Ashworth estate needed live-in staff immediately, no questions asked about gaps in employment, and Amelia had said yes before she let herself think about what kind of household needed no questions asked. The housekeeper who answered the door was a stout woman named Bridget with silver hair pinned into a bun so tight it looked painful. She looked Amelia up and down once, decided something, and stepped back to let her in. "You're the new girl. Mr. Ashworth doesn't do introductions, so don't expect one. Rules are simple. East wing is his. You don't go in unless you're told to. Kitchen closes at 9. Don't be late, don't be slow, and for God's sake don't be seen unless you're meant to be seen." "Understood," Amelia said, though nothing about it felt understood at all. The staff quarters were small but clean, a narrow bed, a narrow window, a view of the kitchen garden going brown with autumn. She unpacked in 11 minutes because there was nothing to unpack. That night she lay awake listening to the house settle around her, unfamiliar creaks and unfamiliar silences, and told herself this was temporary, this was survivable, this was just a paycheck with a very large house attached to it. She did not yet know the name Julian Ashworth the way the rest of the country knew it, only the way Bridget said it, careful and clipped, like a word you didn't want to say wrong in front of the wrong person. She would learn soon enough. Julian Ashworth was 34 years old and had not given an interview in 6 years. He had inherited a shipping empire from a father who barely spoke to him and built it into something 4 times its size before he turned 30, a fact the financial papers loved to repeat alongside words like ruthless and cold and unreadable. He lived alone in a house built for a family of 12, employed a staff of 8 who saw him perhaps twice a week, and had a reputation in the boardroom for silence so absolute that grown executives had been known to fill it with confessions just to make it stop. Amelia met him on her 4th day, and it was nothing like she expected. She had been assigned the library, a room with 2 full walls of books and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in what looked like years, and she was halfway up a rolling ladder reaching for a stack of dust when the door opened without warning. "You're new." His voice came from the doorway, low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. Amelia startled, grabbed the shelf, and nearly took an entire row of leather spines down with her. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read at all, arms crossed, dark hair slightly too long for the tailored suit he wore like armor. "Yes, sir." "Amelia. I started Monday. You're supposed to clock out at 6. It's not 6 yet. It's 6:40. She looked at her watch. It was, in fact, 6:40. "I lost track. I'm sorry, I'll finish tomorrow." "Finish now," he said, which was not what she expected. "I don't like half-dusted shelves." He turned and left before she could answer, and Amelia stood on the ladder for a full minute trying to decide if she had just been reprimanded or given permission to stay. She decided it was both, which seemed to be a theme with Julian Ashworth over the following weeks. He was exacting in ways that made the other staff flinch and oddly generous in ways nobody mentioned out loud, extra pay slipped into envelopes without explanation, a car sent for Bridget when her knee acted up, a standing order that any staff member who wanted to eat the leftover catering from his rare dinners was welcome to it rather than have it thrown away. He was, Amelia decided somewhere in her second month, a puzzle nobody in the house had bothered to solve because it was easier to be afraid of him than to look closer. She caught herself looking closer more than she should have. It happened on a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray afternoon that made the whole house feel like it was holding its breath. Amelia had been sent to freshen the East Wing study, a task normally reserved for Bridget alone, but Bridget had taken ill and there was no one else free. She dusted the shelves with the particular care of someone terrified of breaking something priceless, straightened the papers on his desk without reading them, because reading them was not her job, and she had promised herself, on her very first day, that she would be the kind of employee who did not pry. The diary was not hidden, which was, in hindsight, the strangest part of the whole story. It sat on the corner of the desk beneath a folded newspaper, a plain black leather notebook with a cracked spine and a pen tucked into the elastic loop, the kind of ordinary object that belonged to 1,000 offices and meant nothing until it meant everything. Amelia moved the newspaper to dust beneath it, and the diary slid, and a folded page slipped loose and landed open at her feet. She bent to pick it up, meaning only to fold it back exactly as it had been, and her eyes caught 3 words before her brain could stop them. The new maid. She should have looked away. She told herself later, a dozen times, in a dozen different ways, that she should have looked away, folded the page, set it back exactly where it fell, and never breathed a word of it to anyone. Instead she stood frozen in the gray afternoon light with the paper trembling slightly in her hand, and she read. The new maid caught me watching her again today. I don't know how to explain, even to myself, why I keep finding reasons to walk past the library at the hours I know she'll be there. She hums when she thinks no one can hear her, something off-key and unplaceable, and I have started listening for it the way other men listen for the market opening bell. She apologized for the latter incident 3 separate times before I left the room, as though I am the kind of man who fires people over dust. I did not correct her. I am not sure what kind of man I am anymore, if I am honest, which I rarely am, even here, on paper, where no one is supposed to be watching. My father built this house to be feared in. I have spent 16 years making sure it stayed that way. And now I find myself hoping a girl who owns one coat and asks Bridget twice a week if there's anything extra she can do to earn her keep will look up from her dusting and see something in me worth staying for, which is a foolish thing to write down, and an even more foolish thing to want. Amelia read it twice. Then a third time, because her mind refused to believe the words on the first 2 passes, kept insisting she had misread a name, misunderstood a sentence, projected herself into a private thought that belonged to someone else entirely. But there it was, in handwriting so controlled it looked almost typed, her own shadow self described in a stranger's private grief. The new maid. Her. Watching her. Listening for her. The paper trembled harder now, and she folded it with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, tucked it back beneath the newspaper exactly where it had fallen, and stepped away from the desk as though the wood itself might catch fire. She did not finish dusting the study that day. She told Bridget she felt unwell, which was true in a way that had nothing to do with a fever, and spent the rest of the evening in the staff kitchen staring at a cup of tea that went cold before she remembered it existed. Every version of the last 6 weeks rearranged itself in her mind under this new and impossible light. The way he lingered in doorways a half-second longer than necessary. The way he had once told Bridget, apropos of nothing, that the library should be dusted on Tuesday afternoon specifically, when Amelia's schedule happened to place her there. The extra pay in her envelope that first week, larger than anyone else's, with no note attached. She had thought it was simply the strange generosity of a strange man. Now she wasn't sure what she thought at all. She barely slept. At 2 in the morning she got up and stood at her narrow window looking out at the dark shape of the east wing, one light still burning behind heavy curtains, and she thought about knocking on his door and telling him she knew, and she thought about pretending she had seen nothing at all, and she thought about packing her single suitcase and leaving before dawn so she would never have to find out which choice was the braver one. She did none of it. She went back to bed and lay awake until the sky turned the color of dishwater, and in the morning she reported for duty exactly on time, exactly as though her whole understanding of the man who employed her had not just been quietly rewritten in his own hand. Julian noticed something different immediately. He always noticed things. It was half of what made him unbearable to work for and, apparently, half of what had gotten under Amelia's skin without her permission, but this was different, sharper. She wouldn't meet his eyes at breakfast service. She flinched, actually flinched, when he said good morning in the hallway, a reaction so unlike her usual quiet composure that he found himself replaying the last week in his head, searching for the offense he must have committed without realizing it. He asked Bridget if the new girl was all right. Bridget said she seemed tired, nothing more, and Julian let it go because pressing the matter would have meant admitting he had noticed at all, and admitting he had noticed at all would have meant admitting things he had only ever allowed himself to admit on paper, in a room with the door locked, in handwriting he never let anyone see. He did not know, could not have known, that the door had not been locked that particular Tuesday, and that a woman with one coat and a mountain of debt now knew exactly what he thought of her, in words far more honest than anything he would have dared say aloud. 3 days passed like that, careful and strange, both of them circling a truth only one of them knew existed. Amelia threw herself into work the way people do when they want their hands too busy to let their minds wander, scrubbing baseboards that were already clean, reorganizing the linen closet twice, volunteering for tasks in the West Wing specifically so she wouldn't have to walk past the library at the hour she knew he liked to read. Julian, for his part, retreated further into the silence that had made him famous, taking his meals in the study instead of the small breakfast room, staying later at the office than he had in months, as though distance might solve a problem he couldn't name and wouldn't have admitted to having in the first place. It was Bridget who finally forced the issue, in the way that housekeepers who have run a house for 20 years tend to do, without meaning to and without apology. "You're avoiding him," she said to Amelia on Thursday morning, not looking up from the silver she was polishing. "Don't. He notices everything, that man, even when he pretends not to, and a maid who flinches at her employer draws exactly the kind of attention you don't want in a house like this." "I'm not avoiding him. You've taken the long way to the laundry room 3 days running." "There is no long way to the laundry room, Amelia, I've lived here 11 years. Amelia said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't require explaining the folded page and the words she couldn't unread, and Bridget, mercifully, let the silence sit rather than pushing further, though the look she gave over the silver polish suggested she suspected more than she was saying. That afternoon, fate did what fate does in houses with narrow hallways and inconvenient timing, and put Amelia and Julian in the same corridor with no one else around to soften the moment. She was carrying a stack of fresh linens toward the east wing when his study door opened without warning, exactly as it had that first week, and there he was, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, looking like a man who had not slept properly since Tuesday. They both stopped. The linen sat heavy and forgotten in her arms. "Miss Hart." His voice was careful, the way a man is careful crossing ice he isn't sure will hold him. "You've been unwell." "I'm fine, sir." "You've barely looked at me in 3 days." It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than an accusation, it was concern, plain and unguarded, and something in Amelia's chest cracked open at the sound of it, the same crack that had opened when she read his handwriting and found a man nobody in this house had bothered to look for. "I should get these to the linen room," she said, which was a coward's answer and she knew it the moment it left her mouth. He stepped aside to let her pass, and for one impossible second, as she moved by him in the narrow hallway, their eyes met and held, and she saw in his face the exact expression she had read on paper 3 nights earlier, raw and unguarded and entirely unprepared for the way it was being received. Neither of them said anything else. She walked to the linen room with her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain he must have heard it, and he stood in the hallway for a long moment after she disappeared, one hand braced against the doorframe, wondering what exactly had just passed between them and whether he had imagined the way her breath had caught. If this story feels like it's finding its way into your heart, that's exactly what it's meant to do, so stay with it, because Amelia and Julian are only just beginning to understand what the other one is hiding. That night, unable to sleep again, Amelia did something she had promised herself she wouldn't. She went back to the library, hours after the house had gone quiet, telling herself she only wanted to check that the fireplace was properly banked, which was Bridget's job and not remotely hers, and which fooled absolutely no one, least of all herself. The diary was gone from the study desk. In its place sat a folded note, plain paper, no envelope, addressed simply to her. Her hands shook as she opened it. I don't know what you saw. I don't know if you saw anything at all, or if I've simply lost my composure entirely over the last week and started imagining conspiracies where there are none. But if you did see something, I would rather you heard the rest of it from me than continue to believe I am the kind of man who watches his staff without their knowledge for cruel or careless reasons. I am not cruel, Miss Hart, whatever this house's reputation suggests. I am only, apparently, honest on paper in ways I have never learned to be out loud. If you want to hear the honest version spoken instead of written, I will be in the garden at 11. If you don't come, I will understand, and I will never mention any of this again. Amelia stood in the empty library holding the note with both hands, the fire long since gone cold, and for the first time since the folded page had fallen at her feet, she let herself cry, not from fear or shame but from the sheer, dizzying relief of being seen by someone who had also, somehow, managed to see her back. The garden at 11 was nothing like the garden by daylight. The roses had gone brittle with the cold, the fountain had been shut off for winter, and the only light came from a single lantern hanging near the stone bench where Julian sat with his elbows on his knees, looking less like the most feared name in shipping and more like a man who had spent the last hour rehearsing a speech he still hadn't found the courage to finish. He heard her footsteps on the gravel before he saw her, and he stood so fast the lantern flickered. You came. I almost didn't. I know. Thank you for coming anyway. She stopped a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like something fragile that neither wanted to be the one to break. Finally he exhaled, a long breath that fogged in the lantern light, and looked at her directly, which was more than he had managed in the hallway that afternoon. I owe you an explanation, and an apology, though I'm not entirely sure which order they belong in. You don't owe me anything, sir. Julian, he said. If we're going to have this conversation, I would rather you not call me sir while doing it. A small, involuntary sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, but close enough to make his shoulders drop half an inch. All right. Julian. I write things down that I don't say out loud. I have done it since I was a boy, since my father made it very clear that this house did not tolerate weakness spoken aloud, only weakness that could be locked in a drawer where no one would ever have to witness it. It became a habit. Then it became the only place I was ever honest. I didn't intend for you to see any of it. I want you to know that. I would never have wanted you to find out this way, reading something I wasn't brave enough to say to your face. I shouldn't have read it, she said. I know it wasn't mine to see. I've felt sick about it for 3 days. Don't. His voice cracked slightly on the word, an unfamiliar sound coming from a man whose voice had never cracked in front of a single person in this house. Don't apologize for reading the one honest thing I've written in years. If anything, I owe you a debt for finally forcing me to say it somewhere other than a locked drawer. Amelia looked at him properly then, really looked, past the tailored coat and the reputation and the 6 years of silence the papers loved to write about, and saw instead a man standing in a cold garden at 11 at night because he would rather freeze than let the truth stay unsaid any longer. Why me? She asked, and the question came out smaller than she intended, more vulnerable, the question of a woman who had spent the last year being told by circumstance that she was worth very little to anyone. Julian took a step closer, close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his face, an expression the boardrooms of this country had never once been permitted to witness. Because you hum when you think no one is listening, and it's the only unguarded sound in this entire house. Because you thanked Bridget for a task that wasn't a favor, it was your job, and you thanked her anyway, like kindness was still worth practicing even when no one required it of you. Because you looked at a dust-covered library like it deserved to be cared for properly, the same way you look at everything, as though it's worth more effort than anyone's asked you to give it. I have employed dozens of people in this house over the years, Amelia, and not one of them has ever made me want to be a better version of the man my father raised me to be. Then you arrived with one suitcase and one coat, and 3 weeks later I found myself rearranging staff schedules just to catch 5 extra minutes of a tuneless hum through a library door. She was crying again, quietly this time, the kind of tears that came from being handed something you had stopped believing you deserved. I have nothing, she said. I have debt and a suitcase and a job I'm terrified of losing, and she gestured helplessly at the house behind him, the stone and the ivy and the 16 years of empire building it represented. You're that. I'm a man standing in his own garden freezing because he's more afraid of a maid's opinion than he's ever been of a boardroom full of investors, Julian said. Whatever I am, Amelia, it stopped feeling like enough the moment I realized I wanted you to see all of it, not just the version this house is used to. She closed the distance between them before she let herself think better of it, and he reached for her hand, careful, tentative, as though she might still change her mind and walk back inside, and when she didn't, when her fingers curled into his instead, something in his chest loosened that had been wound tight since he was a boy of 8 years old learning that weakness belonged in locked drawers. They stood like that for a long time, neither speaking, the cold forgotten between them, and somewhere behind the heavy curtains of the east wing, a diary sat closed on a desk, its next entry not yet written, though both of them already knew, without saying it, exactly what it would say. Nothing about the weeks that followed looked like the romance novels Amelia had read as a teenager, the ones with grand gestures and public declarations. Instead it was quieter than that, and somehow more overwhelming for its quietness. Julian started appearing in the library at the exact hour she dusted it, no longer pretending it was coincidence, bringing 2 cups of tea instead of one and setting hers on the small table without a word, as though it had always been part of the ritual. She started leaving the door open when she worked in the East Wing, a small unspoken invitation that he never failed to accept, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and a rare, unguarded smile tugging at the corner of his mouth while she told him about her mother, about the teaching degree she never finished, about the debt she was still working through one careful envelope of extra pay at a time, though he had started slipping in more than either of them ever discussed aloud. They kept it from the rest of the staff at first, not out of shame but out of instinct, the same instinct that made a person cup a candle flame against the wind before it had a chance to catch properly. Bridget figured it out within 2 weeks anyway, because Bridget figured out everything, and she said nothing except to leave an extra biscuit on Amelia's tray at breakfast and to stop assigning her the West Wing on Tuesday afternoons, a small mercy neither of them acknowledged but both of them understood. It was Bridget who eventually cornered Amelia in the pantry with her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised in a way that needed no accompanying words. "I'm not going to ask what's going on between you and Mr. Ashworth," she said, "because I already know, and because it is, frankly, none of my business. But I will say this. That man has not smiled in this house since his father's funeral, and I have worked here 11 years. Whatever you're doing, girl, keep doing it." Amelia flushed to the roots of her hair and mumbled something about the silver needing polishing, and Bridget let her escape with a small, satisfied smile that suggested the matter was closed, at least between the two of them. It could not stay contained to the house forever, of course, and the first real crack in their careful secrecy came at the worst possible moment, the way these things always do. Julian's business partner, a sharp-tongued man named Desmond Price who had known him since university and trusted almost no one outside his own reflection, arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon for what he called a routine check-in and what Julian privately suspected was closer to surveillance. Desmond found Amelia in the library rearranging a shelf of first editions Julian had specifically asked her to catalog, and something in the easy, familiar way she moved through the room, the way she didn't flinch or apologize at his entrance the way staff usually did, caught his attention immediately. "You're new," he said, echoing Julian's own first words to her weeks earlier, though his tone carried none of the warmth. "The maid, is it?" "Amelia Hart," she said, and offered nothing further, which seemed to irritate him more than an apology would have. He left the library without another word, but he found Julian in the study 20 minutes later with an expression that made Julian's stomach drop before Desmond even opened his mouth. "You're sleeping with the help." "That's not, don't insult me by denying it, Julian," I've known you 19 years and I've never once seen you look at a woman the way you looked at her when she walked past the study door just now. You didn't even try to hide it. That's not like you." Julian set down the pen he'd been holding, his jaw tight, and for the first time in years he found himself defending something that had nothing to do with shipping contracts or quarterly earnings. "Her name is Amelia. She is not the help, Desmond, she is a person, and what happens between us is not a boardroom matter for you to weigh in on. It becomes a boardroom matter the moment the papers get hold of it, and they will, because everything gets hold of everything eventually, you know that better than anyone. The Ashworth name doesn't survive a scandal like this cleanly. Your father built this company on the appearance of control, and a billionaire falling for his own maid is exactly the kind of headline that makes shareholders nervous. Then let them be nervous." The words came out steadier than Julian expected, steadier than he felt, and Desmond studied him for a long moment before shaking his head, half amused and half genuinely alarmed. "You've changed." "Good," Julian said. "I was overdue." But after Desmond left, the conversation sat heavy in Julian's chest for the rest of the evening, a warning he couldn't quite shake even as he told himself Desmond's opinion had never mattered before and shouldn't start mattering now. He found Amelia in the kitchen garden at dusk, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather, and he draped his own coat over her shoulders without asking, a gesture that had become as familiar between them as breathing. "Desmond knows," she said quietly, before he could speak. "I could tell by the way he looked at me. It doesn't matter what Desmond thinks. It might matter to the rest of the world, though. And I don't want to be the reason your name ends up in a headline you never asked for." Julian turned her gently to face him, his hands warm on her shoulders despite the cold, and for once in his life the words came without hesitation, without the need for paper or a locked drawer to hold them safely first. "Amelia, I have spent 16 years letting other people decide what my name means. I would very much like to spend the rest of it deciding that for myself, and I would like you standing next to me while I do it, headlines or not." The headline broke on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Desmond's visit, and it broke exactly as badly as Desmond had predicted it would. Someone, a driver or a caterer or one of Desmond's own assistants, nobody ever confirmed who, had sold a photograph to a tabloid, a grainy shot of Julian and Amelia standing close together in the kitchen garden at dusk, his coat around her shoulders, his hand resting against her cheek in a gesture that needed no caption to explain what it meant. The headline read simply, "Billionaire recluse's secret romance with his own maid," and beneath it, in smaller print, a dozen assumptions about Amelia that had nothing to do with who she actually was, that she had targeted him deliberately, that she had engineered the whole thing for money she clearly needed, that a man like Julian Ashworth didn't fall for women like her without an angle somewhere underneath it. Amelia read it standing in the staff kitchen with her tea going cold in her hands, the same tea she had been holding the morning everything changed, and felt something in her chest crumble that had only just finished rebuilding itself. Bridget found the paper before Amelia could hide it and swore under her breath in a way Amelia had never heard the older woman do in 4 months of working there. "That's not you," Bridget said fiercely. "Anyone who's spent 5 minutes in this house knows that's not you. It doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what people believe, and they're going to believe whatever sells more papers." Julian found her 20 minutes later, his own face pale and furious in a way she hadn't seen since the night in the garden, a stack of printouts in his hand documenting every version of the story already spreading across every outlet that mattered. "I'm going to issue a statement," he said. "I'm going to make it absolutely clear that what? That I'm not a gold digger. That you didn't fall for the help by accident." Her voice cracked in a way she hated, exhausted and raw. "Julian, they've already decided who I am. A statement from you isn't going to undo 6 years of reading about you in headlines that made you sound untouchable. It's just going to give them a new story to pick apart, and I'll be the center of it, and so will your company," and Desmond was right, this is exactly the kind of thing that makes shareholders nervous. "I don't care about the shareholders. You should. This is your life's work, Julian, and I won't be the reason it falls apart." He crossed the room and took her hands, holding them the way he had held the folded note that first terrible, wonderful night, careful, deliberate, as though letting go even for a second might mean losing something he had only just learned how to want. Listen to me. I built this company out of a house that taught me love was a weakness to be locked in a drawer. I have spent 16 years being right about business and wrong about nearly everything else. I am not going to let a headline decide the one thing I've finally gotten right. But the pressure did not ease, not that day and not the next, and by the end of the week the board had requested an emergency meeting, a formality Julian had never once been subjected to in his entire tenure, and Amelia watched him leave the house in a suit pressed sharper than usual, his jaw set in the same grim line she imagined he wore in courtrooms she had never seen, though he was no judge, only a man about to defend the one part of his life that had never before required defending. She spent the hours he was gone doing the only thing she knew how to do under pressure, working, scrubbing a kitchen that didn't need scrubbing, folding linens that were already folded, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind spun through every possible outcome, most of them ending with her packing her single suitcase and leaving before anyone had to ask her to. Desmond arrived at the house while Julian was still at the meeting, and Amelia braced herself for another cold appraisal, another reminder of exactly how little she belonged in these halls. Instead he found her in the library, the same room where he'd first placed her, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, which was not what she expected from him at all. "I've known Julian 19 years, and in all that time I never once saw him choose something purely because it made him happy rather than because it made strategic sense. I mistook that change for a liability. I was wrong. Whatever the board decides today, I want you to know I've withdrawn my objection, and I told them as much this morning." "Why the change of heart?" "Because I watched him in that meeting defend you the way he's never defended a single acquisition in 19 years of doing business together, and because a man who fights that hard for something isn't being reckless, he's being honest for possibly the first time in his life, and I was arrogant enough to mistake it for weakness." Amelia didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Desmond gave her a small, unfamiliar nod that might have been the closest thing to approval he was capable of offering, and left as quietly as he'd come. Julian returned at 6 that evening, his tie loosened, his shoulders lighter than they had been in days, and found Amelia waiting in the entrance hall, her whole body braced for whatever news he carried. "The board voted to stand behind me," he said simply. "Unanimously, in the end. Desmond made the case before I even had the chance to." Relief moved through her so fast her knees nearly buckled, and Julian crossed the hall and caught her before they had to, folding her into an embrace that smelled like cedar and cold air and the particular relief of two people who had just watched the worst version of their story fail to become the only version anyone remembered. The house grew quieter after that, not in the way it had been quiet before, heavy with things unsaid, but quiet the way a house settles after a storm has finally passed, easy silences instead of guarded ones. Amelia was moved out of the staff quarters within the month, though she resisted the change longer than Julian expected, insisting she didn't want to be handed anything she hadn't earned herself, and it took him nearly 2 weeks of patient, stubborn arguing over breakfast to convince her that loving him was not a transaction that required her to keep proving her worth with a mop and a duster. She kept working anyway, though, 3 days a week instead of 6, because she liked the rhythm of it, liked knowing the house in a way that had nothing to do with what Julian's money could buy, and because Bridget, who had become something like family in the month since Amelia's arrival, refused point-blank to let anyone else touch the silver. It was on one of those quiet evenings, the fire finally lit properly in the library for the first time since Amelia had arrived, that she found herself telling Julian the parts of her story she had never said out loud to anyone, not even Bridget, not even in the darkest weeks after her mother died. She told him about the hospital corridors that all smelled the same no matter which hospital, about signing forms she didn't understand because there was no one else left to sign them, about coming home from her mother's funeral to a stack of unopened bills and feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely alone in the world. "I used to think needing help made me weak," she admitted, staring into the fire rather than at him, because it was easier to say the true things when she wasn't watching his face change while she said them. "My mother raised me to believe you handled your own problems, you didn't burden other people with them, and then she died and left me a mountain of problems I had no idea how to handle, and I felt like I was failing her every single day I couldn't fix it on my own." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried the particular gentleness he reserved only for her, a tone none of his boardrooms had ever heard. "I understand that better than you might think. My father believed the same thing, that needing anyone was a failure of character, and he raised me to believe it too, which is precisely why I've spent 16 years writing my honest thoughts in a locked drawer instead of saying them out loud to another living person. We were taught the same lesson, Amelia, just by different circumstances. I think we're both still unlearning it." "Are we?" "Unlearning it, I mean. I told an entire boardroom last week that I wasn't willing to lose you over a headline. I would say that qualifies as progress." She laughed, a real laugh, and leaned her head against his shoulder while the fire crackled and the wind pressed softly against the old windows, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, because for the first time in either of their lives, the silence between them didn't feel like something to be afraid of. It was Amelia who brought up the diary again, weeks later, on a night when the house was empty except for the two of them and the low hum of rain against the roof. "Do you still write in it?" she asked. "Every night," Julian admitted. "Old habits. What does it say now?" He hesitated, the same hesitation she remembered from the garden that first night, and then he rose without a word, crossed to the desk in the corner of the library, the same desk where the folded page had once slipped free and changed the entire shape of both their lives, and retrieved the familiar black leather notebook. He handed it to her without opening it himself, a gesture that took more trust than either of them fully understood in the moment, and Amelia opened it to the most recent page with hands that trembled slightly, though this time from something closer to hope than fear. "I used to write in this book because I had no one to say the truth to out loud. I am not sure I need it in quite the same way anymore, though I suspect I will keep writing regardless, because some habits are worth keeping even after the reason for them changes." Tonight I watched Amelia laugh at something Bridget said in the kitchen, an easy, unguarded laugh, the kind this house has not heard in longer than I care to calculate, and I found myself thinking that if my father could see what his cold, careful son has become, he would call it weakness. I have decided I don't particularly care what he would call it. I only know that this house has never once, in 16 years, felt like a home until she started leaving her shoes by the door and humming off-key in rooms she thinks are empty. I intend to ask her to marry me. I have not decided when, or how, only that I intend to, and that for the first time in my entire life, the answer to a decision this large does not frighten me at all. Amelia closed the notebook slowly, tears already gathering, and looked up to find Julian watching her with an expression that held no fear in it whatsoever, only the same steady, unguarded certainty that had been building between them since a folded page first fell at her feet in a room full of dust and old books and, as it turned out, an entire future neither of them had seen coming. He did not decide when until the following spring, and even then, it was not a plan so much as a moment that simply arrived and refused to be postponed a single day longer. The kitchen garden had come back to life by then, the roses no longer brittle with cold, the fountain running again, and Amelia had taken to spending her mornings there before the rest of the house woke, coffee in hand, watching the light come up over the hedges the way she once watched foreign sunrises from a rented flat that never quite felt like home. Julian found her there on a Saturday in April, still in her dressing gown, hair loose and unbrushed, humming that same tuneless, unguarded song that had first caught his attention through a library door a year and a half earlier. He stood in the doorway for a moment just watching her, the way he had learned to do without shame now, no longer hiding the fact that watching her had become one of his favorite habits in a life that had once had very few habits worth keeping. "You're up early," she said without turning around, because she had learned the particular quality of his silence by now, the way it settled differently in a room than anyone else's. "I couldn't sleep." "Bad dreams?" "The opposite, actually." She turned then, curious, and found him crossing the garden toward her with something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not quite nerves, not quite excitement, something new that belonged only to this particular morning. He stopped in front of her, took the coffee cup gently from her hands and set it on the stone bench beside them, and then, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible to the boardrooms and headlines that had once defined him, knelt in the wet grass of the kitchen garden without a single flicker of hesitation. "Julie and I have given a great many speeches in my life," he said, "to shareholders, to boards, to journalists who wanted nothing more than to catch me in a mistake, and I have never once been nervous delivering any of them. I am nervous now, which I take as fairly strong evidence that this is the only speech that has ever actually mattered. He reached into the pocket of his robe and produced a small velvet box, and Amelia's hands flew to her mouth exactly the way they had flown to steady herself the day she nearly toppled a shelf of books off a library ladder, a full circle she hadn't expected to notice until this exact moment. I used to believe love belonged in a locked drawer, something to be written down and never spoken, because speaking it made it real, and real things could be taken from you the way my mother was taken from my father, the way warmth was taken from this entire house the day she died. You changed that. You walked into a home built to be feared in and made it into somewhere I actually want to live, not because of anything you tried to do, but simply because of who you are when no one's asking you to be anything else. I don't want to write this in a diary anymore. I want to say it, out loud, to you, where you can hear it and know it's true. Amelia Hart, will you marry me? She was already nodding before he finished the question, tears streaming freely now, and when she finally found her voice it came out thick and laughing all at once. Yes. Yes, of course, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that were, for possibly the first time in his adult life, visibly unsteady, and when she pulled him up from the wet grass and kissed him, the whole garden seemed to exhale around them, the roses and the fountain and the old stone house that had finally, after 16 long years, become exactly what a home was supposed to be. Bridget found them there 20 minutes later, still tangled together on the garden bench, and took one look at the ring catching the morning light before pressing both hands to her chest and declaring, in a voice that carried clean across the garden and probably into 3 neighboring counties, that she had known it since the very first week, and that someone owed her £50, because apparently there had been a betting pool among the staff for months, and Amelia laughed so hard she nearly fell off the bench entirely. The engagement made headlines too, of course, the same papers that had once painted Amelia as a calculating stranger now scrambling to rewrite the narrative into something softer, more palatable, a Cinderella story instead of a scandal, though by then neither Julian nor Amelia much cared what story the papers chose to tell, because they already knew the true one, the one written first in secret ink in a locked drawer, and later, at last, spoken freely in a garden that had waited 16 years to hear it. The wedding took place in the same garden 6 months later, because Amelia had refused every grand venue Julian's assistant suggested, insisting there was only one place in the world that made sense for the two of them to begin their marriage, and Julian, who had learned by then that arguing with Amelia Hart over matters of the heart was a battle he was destined to lose every single time, agreed without a fight. The roses were in full bloom for the occasion, deep red climbing the old stone walls, and Bridget, who had appointed herself unofficial head of every wedding-related decision from flowers to seating charts, oversaw the whole affair with the fierce, proprietary pride of a woman who had, in her own words, seen this coming from the very first week and deserved at least partial credit for how well it had all turned out. Desmond stood as one of Julian's witnesses, a fact that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier, and he raised his glass at the small reception afterward with a toast that surprised everyone in the garden by being, for possibly the first time in his life, entirely sincere. I have known Julian Ashworth for 20 years, he said, and in all that time, I never once saw him choose something because it made him happy rather than because it made strategic sense, until the day a maid with one coat and a mountain of debt walked into his library and completely dismantled every careful calculation he'd ever made about his own life. I was wrong to warn him away from her. I have rarely been happier to be wrong about anything. Amelia wore her mother's earrings, the one piece of jewelry she had kept through every hard year since the funeral, small and simple against the ivory of her dress, and when she walked toward Julian across the garden grass, past rows of staff who had become something closer to family and a handful of relatives who had shown up despite years of distance, she found herself thinking of the suitcase she had wheeled up the gravel drive that first gray October afternoon, certain she was walking into the least interesting chapter of her life. She had never been more wrong about anything, and she had never been happier to admit it. Julian watched her approach with an expression the tabloids would later describe, somewhat inaccurately, as unreadable, though anyone standing close enough could see exactly what it was, plain and unguarded and entirely without the careful control that had defined him for 16 years before she arrived. When she reached him, he took her hands the same way he had taken them that first terrible, wonderful night in the cold garden, careful, deliberate, as though letting go even for a moment might undo everything they had built since. "I believe I owe you an apology," he murmured, just low enough for her to hear beneath the officiant's opening words. "For what?" "For every year before you arrived that I spent believing this house couldn't hold this kind of happiness." "You're doing it again," she whispered back, smiling. "Doing what?" "Being honest out loud instead of writing it in a drawer." "Old habits," he said, "are worth breaking for the right reasons." They married beneath the same lantern light that had once illuminated a frightened, hopeful conversation on a cold November night, and when Julian kissed his new wife in front of a garden full of people who had watched their careful, quiet love story unfold one dusted shelf and one folded note at a time, the applause that followed carried all the way up to the east wing windows, where a black leather diary sat closed on a familiar desk, its pages full at last of things that no longer needed to stay locked away. They spent their wedding night not in some distant honeymoon suite but in the house itself, the library fire lit properly for the occasion, and somewhere close to midnight Julian retrieved the diary one final time and handed it to Amelia with a small, nervous smile that hadn't entirely disappeared even after everything they'd survived together. "One more entry," he said, "and then I think it's finally allowed to rest." She opened to a blank page and watched him write, slower than usual, more deliberate, and when he finished he turned the notebook so she could read the words for herself. "Tonight I married the woman who read 3 lines of my handwriting and decided to stay anyway, despite every reason a sensible person would have had to run. I no longer need this book to say what I mean, but I find I want to keep one final truth here regardless, so that whoever reads it next, whether that's our own children someday or simply the quiet of this house, will know exactly how it happened. She wasn't looking for a fortune. She was looking for a home, and she built one for both of us without even meaning to, simply by being exactly who she already was." 2 years later, the kitchen garden looked different again, in the way gardens do when a family starts living around them instead of simply through them. A wooden swing hung from the old oak near the fountain, slightly crooked because Julian had insisted on hanging it himself rather than calling anyone qualified, and a small pair of rain boots sat abandoned by the back door, red with white polka dots, exactly the kind of chaos the old Marlowe house would never have tolerated in its stern, silent years. Amelia stood at the kitchen window watching Julian chase their daughter across the wet grass, both of them laughing too hard to actually catch each other. Julian's shirt sleeves rolled up the way they always were now, his jacket abandoned somewhere on the garden bench along with whatever careful reputation the tabloids had once insisted to find him. Their daughter, Eleanor, was 18 months old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn refusal to be picked up before she was good and ready, and she shrieked with delight every time Julian scooped her up anyway, spinning her once before setting her back down to run in wobbling, determined circles across the grass. Bridget appeared in the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on the same kind of tea towel she'd been using for the better part of 13 years, and watched the scene in the garden with the deeply satisfied expression of a woman who had, by her own frequent reminder, called this entire romance from the very first week. "He still can't hang a swing straight," she said. "No," Amelia agreed, smiling. "But he tries. That's the whole trick of it, isn't it? Doesn't have to be straight. Just has to hold." Amelia thought about that longer than the comment probably warranted, watching her husband collapse dramatically onto the grass so their daughter could climb triumphantly onto his chest, laughing in a way the boardrooms of London had never once been permitted to witness, and decided Bridget was, as usual, entirely right. Nothing about the last 4 years had been straight. It had bent and buckled under scandal and doubt and a headline neither of them had asked for, under the weight of 2 families that had never quite learned how to be soft with each other, under Julian's own 16 years of believing love belonged in a locked drawer and Amelia's own quiet conviction that she wasn't allowed to need anyone. But it had held. That was the part that mattered. Julian found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, Eleanor balanced on his hip, grass stains on both their knees, and set their daughter into the high chair with the same focused precision he brought to everything, tightening the tray with careful, deliberate hands before dropping a kiss on top of Amelia's head. She's decided she wants to help make dinner, he said. She's decided she wants to eat the dinner ingredients directly out of the bowl, you mean? That too. Dinner that evening was simple, the way most of their dinners were now, roasted vegetables and bread from the bakery near the old courthouse district that Amelia had discovered during her first lonely months in the city and never stopped visiting, even after there was no longer any need to save money on groceries. Eleanor threw more food onto the floor than she managed to eat, and Julian picked up each dropped piece with the same solemn patience he'd once reserved for boardroom negotiations, and Amelia watched the two of them, father and daughter, dark eyes and stubborn chins, and felt something settle in her chest that she still, even now, occasionally couldn't quite believe belonged to her. After Eleanor was down for the night, tucked into a room that had once been a guest suite in Julian's father's cold, silent house and was now covered in soft yellow paint and a mobile of paper stars Amelia had made herself, the two of them settled into the library the way they had 1,000 evenings before, the fire lit properly, the way it always was now, the way it had never been before she arrived. Julian pulled the familiar black notebook from the desk drawer, worn soft with age, its spine cracked in a dozen new places since the night a folded page first slipped loose and changed the whole direction of both their lives. Still writing, Amelia said, settling against his side on the sofa, one hand resting over his heart the way it always did when the house went quiet like this. Still writing, he agreed. Though these days it's mostly things I've already said out loud to you first. I think the book knows it's not needed the way it used to be. I keep it anyway. Some habits are worth keeping. That's precisely what I told you the day I proposed. You did. I was there. He laughed, low and unguarded, the sound that had first cracked something open in her on a cold November night in a garden she'd been too frightened to walk into, and opened the notebook to a fresh page, pen already in hand. Amelia watched him write, unhurried, the firelight catching the gray that had started creeping gently into his dark hair, and when he finished he turned the book so she could read it, the way he always did now, no secrets left worth locking away. For years ago a woman with one suitcase and one coat walked up the drive of a house built to be feared in, and by accident, by nothing more than a fallen page and an honest heart, she taught its owner how to be found instead. Tonight our daughter fell asleep with paper stars turning slowly above her bed, in a room that used to sit empty and cold, in a house that finally, after everything, deserves to be called a home. I do not know what I did to earn this life. I only know I intend to spend the rest of it making certain I never take a single ordinary evening of it for granted, not the spilled dinner, not the crooked swing, not the woman asleep against my shoulder by the time I finish writing this last line. Amelia was already asleep against his shoulder exactly as he predicted, the fire burning low and warm in the old stone library, and Julian closed the notebook gently, set it aside, and simply sat there for a long while in the quiet he had once been so afraid of, listening to the house breathe around them, finally, completely, entirely alive. If this story found its way into your heart, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in slow, quiet, ordinary love. New stories are on the way every week, and we can't wait to bring you the next one.